Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar on monitoring intervention fidelity. Hopefully everyone can hear me clearly and that you can see the slideshow that's in front of you. My name is Sarah Blower and I'm joined by my colleague Laura Wybra. We are both from the Social Research Unit and we will be co-delivering this fifth webinar in the Realising Ambition Intervention Support Series. We'll start off with a few housekeeping items for those who are joining us for the first time. You should have a question and answer box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. In that control panel, you can type in your questions or comments as we run through the webinar. If you run into any technical problems, you can try getting our attention by clicking on the Hands Up button, which you can find on the left-hand tab of your control panel. Just to make sure that you can all hear us and that you found the hands up button on the control panel, can we just take a minute for you to click that button now so that we can check you can all hear me? Great, I can see all the hands going up. Looks like a load of high fives, which is great. So you can click that button again now to put your hand down so that we know that everything's okay. This webinar will be recorded and it will be available for you to download in the next few weeks, and we'll send those details through to you. So if you do have any technical problems in the next hour and we can't resolve them for you, you will be able to access the webinar at a later date. So this is the fifth in a series of 6 webinars that we're running for Realising Ambition. It's called Monitoring Intervention Fidelity. The recordings of our previous 4 webinars are available on our website. The address for that is www.dartington.org.uk, and we'll be uploading the recording of this webinar on there in a few days. As you probably know by now, this webinar will last for roughly an hour. It's divided into 4 parts. So we'll start off by giving you a presentation that will then be followed by a discussion where we'll try to take the questions that you pose throughout the webinar and answer them. And then that will be followed by another presentation and another discussion session. If we don't get a chance to get through all of your questions, we will collate them and we will send round a frequently asked questions document after the webinar, as we have done on previous occasions. So in a moment, I will hand over to Laura, who will be delivering the first input on what is fidelity and why it is important. And a little later on, I'll be delivering the second input, looking at how to develop ways of monitoring fidelity. So I think we're ready to begin, and I'll hand it over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so let's start by asking, what is fidelity? The term fidelity means the extent to which a program or service is delivered as it is intended to be. Using our favorite cake analogy, we know that if we stick to a recipe as documented in the cookbook, it is likely that our cakes will end up looking and tasting the way they are supposed to. We call this high fidelity, and it leads to better outcomes. However, if we drift from the recipe, for example by experimenting with ingredients or adapting quantities, we know that there is less chance that the cakes will turn out well. In fact, they may even be harmful. We call this low fidelity, and it can lead to poorer outcomes. The same is true for interventions designed for children and families, whether they are innovations or well-tested evidence-based programs. In either case, you need to measure how well the intervention is implemented in comparison with the original design, or the recipe, in order to be confident that it will achieve good outcomes, or a tasty cake. Fidelity can be broken down into lots of different components. In today's webinar, we'll focus on 4 that have been shown in research to be critical factors in successful replication and achieving impact on child outcomes. These are adherence, dose, quality, and user engagement. We'll now go through each of these in more detail. If we use the example of baking a cake, adherence refers to our faithfulness to the instructions set out in the recipe. It encompasses the key steps in the process of creating the cake, the ingredients needed, the oven temperature and timing, the utensils needed, etc. And so it is with interventions for children and families. It is important to look at whether the core components of an intervention are being delivered as designed. Are the right sessions going to the right people in the right order, using the right materials and delivered in the right place by someone with the right training? It is about practitioners using the practices, materials, and tools in the recommended sequence and manner. Put another way, do they deliver the program content by the book? And is it delivered to the right people, which we focused on in our second webinar in this series for Realizing Ambition? As an example, the Incredible Years Parenting Program seeks to change parents' behavior by helping them to learn positive parenting strategies, practice them, and reflect on their effect. It includes videos, role play, and facilitated group discussion. Opting to leave out the videos because there is no TV available, or avoiding the role play because it makes people feel uncomfortable, will undermine how the program works and will reduce the effect of the program on child outcomes. We also need to know if an intervention is being delivered in the right dose. Our trusted cake recipe details the quantity of each ingredient that we need and the amount of time it takes to cook the cake and to let it cool. Another example, if we stop talking about food for a second, comes from medicine. Just as courses of medical treatment usually stipulate how many pills must be taken over what period in order to make the patient better, so interventions in children's services increasingly say how many sessions of what length and frequency must be delivered. This is what we mean by dose. For example, in parent-child interaction therapy, which focuses on externalizing child behavior problems, the standard treatment dose consists of 12 half-hour weekly sessions with a 1-hour booster session 1 month after treatment ends. Research finds that many interventions show a dose-response effect, where outcomes improve with greater amounts of intervention delivered. This can also pinpoint the minimum of intervention required to improve outcomes, such as attending at least 8 out of 12 sessions. Quality refers to the manner in which the intervention is delivered. This includes the practitioner's preparation, attitude, enthusiasm, and ability to respond to participants. In the case of making a cake, quality refers to the chef's technical skills, presentation skills, and also their passion. In the same way, we need to know, is the practitioner delivering a parenting program sensitive, warm, and empathetic? Do they work to encourage all parents in a session to engage in group discussions, or will they let some sit back and not take part? As well as having an impact on how much each participant gets out of the intervention, this also contributes to the final aspect of fidelity, which is user engagement. It can be helpful to measure the extent to which children, parents, or families receiving an intervention are engaged and involved. We refer to this as user engagement. How consistently do participants stick with the program? Do they attend? Do they like it? Do they get involved? For example, do they take part in discussion, or do they sit in the corner scowling? Do they try out new techniques or behaviors they are taught, or do they ignore them? To continue the cooking analogy, do the consumers taste the product and do they enjoy it? So that covers what fidelity is, but why is it important? As you have seen from the examples above, it is all about increasing the likelihood that your intervention will have the expected impact on outcomes. A lot of thought goes into the design of an intervention. We've been encouraging you to think about what is done, to who, when, and why, for example. And all these decisions should be based on evidence about what is most likely to work to improve outcomes. Therefore, when your intervention is ready to be replicated, you'll want to be sure that it will be delivered in a way that best represents what it is that you have designed, because that's what you think is necessary to achieve the change in outcomes. Developing a process for monitoring fidelity will also allow you to ensure your intervention has the best chance of improving outcomes when replicated. We want to see lots of replication of the cake with the cherries on top, and none of the disastrous cakes. Monitoring fidelity will also help an intervention to avoid failure when replicated by others. Furthermore, from an evaluator's perspective, he or she would want to be confident that the program implementation is achieving reasonably high levels of fidelity before embarking on a robust evaluation. We need good levels of fidelity, otherwise we don't know what we're evaluating. While there will always be some variation in fidelity between program deliverers in different sites, as long as reasonable levels of fidelity are achieved, we can be confident that the effect that an intervention shows is down to the intervention as designed. For the proven programs that have previously been evaluated, the evidence shows over and over that delivering these programs as intended is key to achieving program impact. Evidence-based programs must be delivered with high fidelity because this is the model by which they have been evaluated and proven. This is what we know works, and drifting from the specified delivery protocol will reduce impact on outcomes. This chart shows how high fidelity is associated with better outcomes. It looks at the effect of one evidence-based program, functional family therapy, on the rate of young people's reoffending. The grey bar on the far left shows the rate of reoffending for young people who did not get FFT, 28%. Then each red bar represents a practitioner who delivered FFT. The taller the bar, the worse the outcome. Practitioners have been grouped by the extent to which they delivered the program as it was designed. The further they are to the right of the chart, the closer they kept to the original design. Overall, the bars get shorter as fidelity gets better, suggesting that higher fidelity results in better outcomes. Good delivery delivers the goods. But there is lots of variation. For example, some bars are very short, particularly the one for practitioner 1. This looks like an exceptional example of a skilled practitioner, or a lucky one. He or she did not do the program as designed, but still got great results. Fidelity is really important, but there is clearly something about the individual practitioner that matters. However, when you look on balance, it is true that the higher the fidelity, the better the chance of improved outcomes. Some practitioners have skills that are so well honed they can improve outcomes without following an explicit program. There are more whose natural skills are enhanced by a manualized program. The combination of their abilities and the structure and content of a program results in better outcomes. Unfortunately, there are some practitioners who, even when they try to follow a manualized evidence-based program to the letter, fail to make a positive impact. And any practitioner can be lucky or unlucky due to circumstances beyond his or her control. The power to change the lives of children and families lies with the practitioner. A manualized program is nothing without the person delivering it. To implement with high fidelity, practitioners need to be highly skilled. If a manualized program is the recipe, then the practitioner is the cook. We are going to move on now to our discussion section, And I know that Sarah has been collating some questions for us to answer. And if you have any others, then by all means, please keep sending them through. But we'll take the first one now. So Sarah, what have we got?
Okay, thanks, Laura. So we've had a few questions through, and some of them are fairly similar. So I'm going to try and paraphrase them so that we can address them together. And there are also some questions to do more with how to develop measures and ways of monitoring fidelity that I think I would like to park until the end of the next presentation, because they'll be easier to respond to once we've covered some of that other content. So there are a few questions to think about now. And the first one, again, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, is if evidence-based programs are supposed to be delivered as intended, how can we adapt them, and should we? And I'll probably take this one because Laura's had to present to you for the last few minutes. So there's a few things to say about that. So most evidence-based programs will stipulate either in their manuals or their materials the core elements of the program and things that are more flexible. So the core elements are things that are kind of like active ingredients. They are the parts of the intervention that create impact on outcomes, and they're non-negotiable. You shouldn't tinker with them. And then there are other elements of the program that are a little more flexible. And so usually those things will be stipulated, and you'll have some room to make some kind of adaptations along those lines. And there's also a distinction that we've talked about in previous webinars between surface adaptation and deep adaptation. So if you are replicating an evidence-based program and you want to take a core component out, say there's a child component and a parent component, and you want to remove the parent component, you're not only kind of affecting fidelity there, you're making fundamental kind of deep changes that will affect the theory of change or logic model underpinning the intervention. So Realizing Ambition is a program of replication, so we wouldn't be expecting any of the interventions in the portfolio to be making those kinds of changes. And if they are, those would be in real close consultation with both the program developers and also with the consortium, so ourselves, Young Foundation, Catch-22 and Substance. And any of those kind of deep adaptations would also need to be signed off by Catch-22. More surface level adaptations, so this might be translating materials or changing examples in workbooks that are more kind of culturally relevant to the populations that you're replicating with, are kind of less, they tinker less with the underlying logic model, so they are they're possible within the remit of Realizing Ambition. Again, we would always encourage you to kind of connect with the program developers, and by all means get in touch with us at SRU to kind of talk through that. And again, any adaptations just need to be run past Catch-22. Any kind of adaptations you make, we would always suggest that you then kind of test and monitor those. So you might have tinkered with a program, but then you want to test fidelity to those changes and see what impact they have. And with evidence-based programs, there's always an element of creativity possible. So you may not make adaptations that affect adherence, quality, dose, etc. But you may have room to be more creative around other things that kind of affect uptake of the program. So you might be able to get creative about how you recruit and engage participants. So I guess that's probably quite a long answer to that question, and I will stop talking and ask Laura a question instead. So a couple of people have said that you mentioned at one point, Laura, that we're covering 4 aspects of fidelity. Are there others? What are they? Do we need to know about them?
That's right, we did say that. In the research literature, different researchers break fidelity down into different components. In many cases, they comprise the 4 that we have talked about: adherence, quality, dose, and user engagement. But sometimes they include other elements as well. Perhaps most important for realizing ambition is the idea of serving the right people. So making sure that the children, young people, or families who receive the intervention closely match the target group for the intervention as set out in the manual. And this is important for fidelity because the most effective intervention for improving the behaviour of preschool children will have little chance of widespread impact if you deliver it to secondary school students, for example. And similarly, if a programme seeks to improve children's behaviour by improving parenting, then it makes little sense to deliver it to parents whose parenting is already good or whose children's behaviour is poor for another reason. If the wrong children or families get the intervention, then they might be harmed, and at best they are unlikely to benefit much and will be taking the place of someone who could benefit more, which is a waste of resources. So establishing and documenting a participant's eligibility for your intervention will help to ensure that it's only delivered to those it is designed for, to maximise chances of improving outcomes for this population. And the reason we left this out of the webinar today is not because this element of fidelity is not important. Actually, it's so important that we dedicated a whole webinar to the topic. And if you haven't already watched that, then we would recommend you check it out.
Okay, so we've got a couple more questions here. So just thinking about which one to take next. So there's an interesting one that's come in where someone has asked or has kind of posed, evidence-based programs are often criticised for being prescriptive. What is your view on that, and how would you answer that to someone who suggests it? It is something that comes up a lot, and it's a real challenge, and I think there's two really important things to say about it. Manualised programs are quite prescriptive, and that's because they usually have had decades of science testing the underlying logic model, trying to figure out the problem that's at hand and how to best solve that. So they're backed up by kind of really rigorous research, and so that kind of prescriptive manual reflects all of that energy and science and money and investment that's been made in developing the intervention. But having said that, even the most kind of prescriptive interventions still rely on practitioner skill. And there are always moments when delivering an intervention that can't be predicted. So potential responses from in a group, somebody getting upset, etc., kinds of things that you can't predict, that rely on an individual practitioner having the right skills to deal with and bring it back to the intervention content. And then the other kind of thing to say about that is that the next kind of generation of implementation research and prevention science is really starting to look at what are the really key elements of programs that cause them to have those positive effects, and can we pull those out of package programs and deliver them more flexibly, so less prescriptively. And it's a kind of direction that the research is heading in. There aren't any answers just yet, but it's the next generation of prevention science, and we're all kind of waiting with bated breath to see what happens with that. So that's how I would respond to that question. We've also had a few that get at, okay, so you've mentioned several at different elements of fidelity, so adherence, dose, quality. Are there any that are more important than others? And linked to that, you mentioned what is a reasonable level of fidelity. What is a reasonable level of fidelity? So these again are really, really interesting questions. And again, they are questions that researchers, to a certain extent, are still grappling with. So again, next generation of studies will be looking to randomly allocate children to interventions delivered with high fidelity, with middle levels of fidelity, and low levels of fidelity, to see whether there's any kind of difference in impact when compared to kids who don't receive the intervention. We know, broadly speaking, that all of these aspects of fidelity have a connection to outcomes, and perhaps the strongest evidence is in relation to dose, and that's probably because it's easier to measure, both from a research perspective but also for those implementing programs on the ground. And the research literature shows that the higher the dose, usually the better chance of getting impact on outcomes. But we still don't know quite how much. Laura talked earlier about some programs go for between half and three quarters of the intervention to be delivered to get effects. But again, we need this next generation of science to kind of give us the answers. In the meantime, I think from our perspective, we would always recommend that you consider all four of those elements. Maybe as you develop an innovation or become more experienced replicating an evidence-based program, you would build in new layers. So you would start maybe with adherence and dose, and then build to look at quality, etc., over time. Yep, so I think that's probably those questions. And then I think we've got probably time for just one more, which I will let Laura answer. So a couple of people have asked us whether we will be, so I guess we is SRU, will be able to help them design a way to check whether they are replicating with high fidelity.
That's a good question, and the answer is yes. So in the next section of the webinar, Sarah is going to run through some of the common methods for monitoring fidelity. So that is a good starting point. But fidelity is also, for many projects in the Realising Ambition portfolio, a focus of our bespoke intervention support. Usually this support would follow in a sequence after the logic model and manual development work, because in many respects, those two pieces of work are necessary precursors to developing fidelity monitoring systems. And you should feel free to get in touch with your leader SRU or any of the team when you're ready to start thinking about this.
Great, okay, so I think it's probably time to move on to the second input. So that will be me then. So in this section of the webinar, we would like to try and get into the detail of what are the different types of methods for monitoring fidelity and measuring it, and how might you go about developing your own. So whether you've decided to develop your own intervention, or you are using or replicating one developed by someone else, you want to know that it's going to be delivered well. So as Laura described in her presentation, even the best interventions, when delivered badly, so in other words, with low levels of fidelity, they have little chance of improving outcomes. And there are several different ways to promote high fidelity in programme delivery. And at the Social Research Unit, we think there are at least 5 important things to consider. So the first is to describe in detail in a manual what the programme is and how it should be implemented. The second is to get the programme to the right children and young people. So these first two issues we've covered in quite a lot of detail in previous webinars. So if you go to our website, you'll find our first webinar on manuals and our second webinar on getting interventions to the right people. Oh, yeah. And then the third and fourth ways to promote high fidelity are to get the right people delivering the programme, and then fourthly, to train and support those people to continue to deliver the programme well. These two particular issues are not covered in as much detail in these webinars. We will pick up in the kind of final webinar, which is in a couple of months' time. It's called Specifying Human and Financial Resources. And there are also issues that we can address in our one-to-one bespoke support if it's in your support plan. And so finally, the fifth way to promote fidelity is to monitor what the people delivering the programme actually do. And in this part of the webinar, we'll give you some ideas about how to go about deciding which aspects of fidelity to measure, how to measure them, and how, really importantly, to use the information to improve practice. So if you are implementing an intervention that already exists off the shelf, you may find that it comes with a ready-made method for measuring fidelity. If that can be used, it will save you a lot of work, but I would urge you to make that decision quite carefully. So on the plus side, it is likely that the method is tried and tested and that it covers many of the core intervention elements, but it's wise to be alert to potential drawbacks. So if you want to use the existing methods in a different context, you might need to adapt them slightly. So, for example, you might need to simplify measures if there's less time to gather the information required. And similarly, you might find it appropriate in some cases to use a more collaborative and less judgmental approach. So, in the case of a school based programme, that might involve rating the quality of teachers' delivery in collaboration with them rather than independently on them. If you are designing a method for measuring the fidelity of a new intervention, it will be much easier to do this if it's clear what the main components of the intervention are and the practical steps and standards for delivering those components. And so the exercise of putting together a logic model and a manual should really help you out here. A logic model or theory of change is a good starting point. It illustrates what the core components of the intervention are and how they interact with particular risk and protective factors to achieve outcomes for children or young people. So you can see in the example on the screen, in the blue bubbles, that the core components of the intervention are brokering and advocacy, cognitive behaviour therapy, and parenting skills training. This is a hypothetical example. So you would want to measure when you're looking at fidelity how well each of those components are delivered. A programme manual is also a useful tool in the development of fidelity measures. A manual should specify clearly the detail around each of those main components. So it spells out the nuts and bolts of what should be done, when it should be done, by whom, and for how long. Armed with a logic model and a manual, you can decide what you need to measure in order to say something about each of these key dimensions of fidelity. So if we look back to Laura's input, those key elements are adherence, so whether the core components of the intervention are being delivered as designed. Are the sessions being delivered to the right people in the correct sequence, using the proper materials, and so on? Quality, that refers to the manner in which the intervention is delivered, including a practitioner's levels of preparation, their attitude, their enthusiasm, and so on. Dose, again, that refers to the number of sessions that should be delivered and their length and frequency. And then user engagement, which refers to the extent to which the children, parents, or families receiving the intervention are engaged and involved. When deciding exactly how to measure these various aspects of fidelity, you need to ask yourself, how practical is this method I'm thinking about? And basically what we're getting at there is, will people actually do it? And will the information gathered be useful? So will it be trustworthy and will it help to improve delivery? There is no set way to measure fidelity, so you can theoretically choose to do it in a way that works best for your intervention and for the people delivering it. Whatever you choose to do, be sure to spell it out, ideally in a manual or an implementation handbook. So detail who is measuring fidelity, what information is being collected and how, whom it will be shared with and in what format and how it will be used. Perhaps the most simple method for collecting information on fidelity is the self-rating checklist. And these checklists can be completed by the people delivering the program as well as the people receiving the program. Checklists can be used to measure adherence and quality aspects of fidelity. One common method is to ask the person delivering the intervention to complete a checklist after each session to indicate what they did in the session and how well it worked. And these checklists could be completed on paper at the end of the session, or perhaps could be completed online at a later date. So you can see here an example on the screen from an evidence-based program called the Incredible Years program. And Laura talked about Incredible Years earlier. She described how the program seeks to change parents' behaviour by helping them to learn positive parenting strategies, to practice them, and then to reflect on their effect. And key elements of that program are videos, which you can see on the checklist are referred to as vignettes. So they are short videos that cover kind of key aspects of children's behaviour in real life situations. Sessions also involve role play and facilitated group discussion, and those are really core elements of the program. And you can see there in the questions in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 that those key elements of the program are covered, and the leader or the program deliverer is required to enter a simple tick to say whether or not they've done it. So opting to leave out the videos because there's no TV in the room, or avoiding the role play because it makes people feel uncomfortable, will undermine how the program works, and it will reduce the effect of the program on child outcomes. So all of these key elements are captured in the checklist for leaders to complete at the end of each session, and that allows implementers to monitor how well the program is being delivered. It's also very typical for services to use checklists to find out what it is like to receive the intervention. So, in other words, to measure user engagement. You can give participants or people attending the program a list of key intervention activities and ask them to say which one they received or which ones they received. You can also ask them what their subjective experience was. So, did they like the intervention? Did they find it useful? Did they think that the staff were helpful and approachable? And you could apply these checklists in a face to face interview situation, or over the phone, or by asking people to fill in a written questionnaire. Checklists in a very simple form can also be used to measure dose, so to keep a record of the frequency and length of contact between program deliverers and recipients. So, for a structured group based program like Incredible Years, this might involve keeping an attendance register to be completed at the beginning of each session. For a more flexible one to one intervention, where the exact time spent with a young person varies according to their needs, you might instead keep a record of the number of program sessions held, as well as the amount of time spent with each young person on a weekly basis. There are many advantages to using checklist measures. It's fairly obvious that they're cheap to develop and implement, and they usually take really minimal time to complete. There are drawbacks, however. By their very nature, self-rated checklists are open to bias. So service users might give biased responses due to their personal feelings towards a practitioner, and practitioners might report high levels of fidelity because of a desire to please program managers. It's also true that some people might experience poor recollection when completing self-rated checklists if they're not done straight after a session is finished, which is often the case when you're using an online survey. Research on fidelity in the implementation of evidence-based programs shows that practitioners do tend to have rose-tinted glasses, as we probably all do, when it comes to reporting their own performance on fidelity questionnaires. So just some things to bear in mind there with the checklist methodology. In another popular method, independent observers, so that could be program managers, fellow practitioners, researchers, or coaches or trainers, they'll watch the intervention actually being delivered and rate how good it is. So, for example, they might sit at the back of the room while a session is being delivered to a group of young people and score how well different elements are delivered. They look for evidence that core intervention components are covered and that the person delivering the group session knows the content and structure and says and does the right things when interacting with the service users. So in other words, they're looking for evidence of adherence and quality of delivery. A variation on that approach involves videotaping sessions and then having a trainer or some kind of independent observer do ratings remotely, so they're not in the room. Whether you're doing observation in person or using videotapes, observers would typically have a checklist of things to be looking out for, and that might be very similar to the checklist that the program deliverer themselves completes. Observation does address some of the problems with bias and reliability that we can encounter when using self-rated checklists. So it can be a really useful tool, an independent method for gauging user responsiveness. So through observation, we can detect non-verbal forms of communication, such as eye contact and body language. And in the case of group-based programs, we can see the extent to which all individuals in the group are engaged and contribute to the discussion. However, clearly, such an approach can be a resource-intensive one. And in a large-scale implementation of a program across counties or countries, getting observers to program sessions might be costly and logistically difficult. And it's also possible that some practitioners might deliver the program differently when under observation. So, for example, they may make a concerted effort not to deviate from the program content in an attempt to make a good impression. The video approach also has some drawbacks. So, whilst it's probably true that video cameras are smaller and cheaper than ever, they can still be a real stretch for tight budgets. And of course, some service users may not be at all comfortable, or it may not be appropriate for them to appear on video. So we've looked at some of the ways to measure fidelity, but the next important, and it's a really important issue, is to think through how best to use the information, the data that you collect. So at a minimum, you want fidelity data to help the people delivering the intervention to deliver it better. In other words, to know when they are doing it well so that they can continue in that vein, but also to help them strengthen other areas in which they might be weaker. So the intervention manager will find it helpful to have an overview of how well staff are doing, and that then in turn may give a sense of how effective the training and technical assistance that is being provided is. Information about fidelity can also help the person or people who are delivering the technical assistance or coaching to work out what they should really be focusing on when they're working with practitioners. Information on fidelity should be fed back to the relevant person. So that could be the practitioner or a coach or a manager or so on. And it should be fed back in the most appropriate way. It's probably best when given by a person who is a respected source and with some accompanying written material. The feedback should be tailored according to the likely motivations of the person receiving it. So, for example, for those delivering the intervention, you could frame it in terms of how to improve the experience of the service user. Feedback also needs to be timely. So ideally fairly frequent and in some kind of recurring loop, say weekly or monthly, depending on the length of the intervention. Organisations will need a method for collecting accurate and real-time data on fidelity and programme delivery that can be used to identify good practice and highlight practitioners or sites that might need additional support. Checklists are easy and quick to complete on a regular basis, but more intensive methods such as live or video observation might be done less frequently. So you could adopt a sampling approach where you observe sessions at random or particular sessions in a sequence. So, for example, in a 12-week group program, you might observe sessions 4 and session 8. Finally, I guess while it might seem quite onerous to have to develop processes and procedures for monitoring fidelity, there are some real tangible benefits from doing so. And I think this is a really good place to end this presentation. So the first is that research shows that the act of monitoring fidelity itself actually helps to promote high levels of fidelity. So when people delivering a program have to keep a record of what they're doing, or when they know someone else is keeping a record of what they're doing, they're more likely to deliver what they are supposed to deliver. Secondly, information on fidelity allows you to ensure that the program is being delivered as intended to the right people. It allows you to reflect on the quality of delivery and respond to situations where it is not optimal. And really importantly, all of this will contribute to improved outcomes for those receiving the programme. So I think that's the end of the second input, and there's quite a lot in that. So hopefully we've got some good questions, and I will hand over to Laura to pose away.
We do have some good questions. I'll take the first one. It asks, what would you recommend as the minimum we should do to monitor fidelity? Which is a great question. And we'd say that certainly for evidence-based programs, they may be well aware of, they have sometimes extensive systems designed to monitor fidelity, and it might be part of your licensing agreement that you comply with those systems. But for those of you developing interventions or implementing programs that don't have a fidelity monitoring system, we'd recommend that at a minimum you develop a simple checklist for practitioners so that they can self-rate adherence and quality. And we'd also encourage you to also keep good records on attendance or time spent with program recipients in order to be able to say something about dose. And we've already described some of the reasons why this is important. Realizing ambition is all about replication, so you are responsible for ensuring that what is delivered is a replication of the evidence-based or the promising program that you received the funding for. But arguably more importantly, we've been working with many of you, and you've invested a lot of time in developing logic models and a theory of change for your interventions that represent your theory about how and why your intervention will achieve positive outcomes. So it's therefore in your best interest to monitor that what is being delivered reflects the core components in your logic model.
So, sorry, I've just leaned over Laura and seen a really interesting question on the computer. So, one of our attendees has asked about, has posed an interesting comment. So he says the idea of dose is interesting. In terms of reporting outcomes and meeting targets of participants, is it therefore safe to argue that someone who has completed some but not all of the intervention programme would be considered to have completed the programme? And that is a really interesting question. There are some evidence-based programmes that have who have got a research base that has investigated the impact of dose on outcomes. So they have been able to extrapolate how much of the intervention you need to deliver in order to see some effect. And generally, again, some of those interventions would either say half or 3/4 of the intervention. And they would describe people who've attended half or 3/4 in those programs as completers. So they're completers in the sense that they've received enough of the program that we should start to see an impact on outcomes. Again, that those are programs where there's some good evidence and data on dose. So it would be, I guess, difficult to do that with a program where you don't have that data, and you would have to have a good kind of hypothesis or theory about why a certain amount would be enough to be described as a completer. I guess when you are doing that, you would think about what the research says about similar programs that have been tested, what the dose levels relationship with outcomes are for those. And you'd also, I guess, if you're designing a new intervention, be thinking about building in an element of understanding that many recipients of a program won't attend all sessions. So particularly community-based interventions where you haven't haven't got a captive audience like you have in a school or perhaps in a home, where you're expecting people to come to a children's centre or a church or wherever the program's being delivered in the community. You might build in an element that you expect people not necessarily to turn up to all of the sessions, and have some kind of hypothesis about how much they need to attend to get the impact on outcomes. Sorry, I'm struck by that question.
There's another one here that I think is a particularly nice one, which I'll pass to you, Sarah. And it asks, we want to develop a checklist. Have you got any examples, and how do we go about scoring them?
Okay. So first of all, have we got any examples? There are lots of examples out there. So that Incredible Years example that was on the slide is freely available on the internet. And if you do a Google search on Fidelity Checklist, you'll get loads of examples coming back, and a Google image search as well. You'll find lots coming back. Again, take it with a pinch of salt. Some of them may not be good quality, but they'll give you a sense of the length and the breadth of checklists. Typically, they would use a scoring system that's based on a kind of yes or no tick box, and that's particularly useful for measuring adherence, where you have a list of things that have to be delivered, and it's a simple yes or no whether or not they've happened. But in some cases, you might want to collect some more nuanced data. So particularly, I guess, for quality, you might want to rate quality of delivery on a sliding scale of, excellent, very good, not good, atrocious. I'm not sure what those categories would be, but you might want more nuanced data. Whatever you do, try to keep it simple, because you're going to have to analyse and add up those scores at the end of it. And if this is the first time you're developing fidelity measures, really do try to keep it simple. Perhaps focus on adherence and dose, because those are the easier categories of fidelity to start measuring. We can go into this in a lot more detail in our bespoke one-to-one support. So, thinking about your very specific interventions, what kinds of things you need to be monitoring, and what the best way of kind of scoring and collecting data and using it is. So we'd be really happy to help those of you where we've agreed that it's part of your support plan on that. I hope that answers that question. Well, we've got time for we've got a minute, so we've got time for one more. So, oh yes, Laura, you can have this one. Do you have to get ethical approval or consent to do video observations?
That is a really important issue, and we'd say you have to comply with your own organisation's ethical guidelines and policies about things like this. There are some ways to limit the visibility of programme recipients on video recordings, by angling the camera straight at the practitioner, for example. But whether you choose to do that or to video everyone in the room, it's a really important ethical requirement. that you obtain written and informed consent from everyone in the room. So that means being clear about why you're recording the session, who is going to view it, and what the purpose of that will be.
Okay, so that's dead on 1:30. So I hope this has been a useful webinar. We've really appreciated your questions, really great questions, really interesting, stimulating. So if you have any kind of further comments or suggestions or questions, please feel free to get in touch with either Laura or myself, or we can chat about it in our intervention support bespoke stuff. So I hope you've enjoyed the webinar, and I hope that we get to see you all fairly soon. Take care, and we'll see you in a couple of months for the next webinar on specifying financial and human resources.